Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à l'ambassade du Canada. C'est un plaisir de vous accueillir ici. We are here this afternoon for the National Endowment for the Arts panel discussion, Creative Placemaking, which will discuss the role of the arts in creating livable, sustainable communities. I would like to extend an especially warm welcome to the members of today's panel who are here with us to share their expertise, experiences, and visions of creative placemaking and the artist's role as a creative placemaker. Sustainable living is an issue that sees no borders and affects communities around the globe. Innovative by nature, artists have valuable contributions to offer to the discussion. Panels like Creative Placemaking are platforms for experts in the field to discuss the importance of the artist's role and voice within placemaking. I'm delighted to have with us today Rocco Landesman, Chairman, National Endowment for the Arts, and Robert Sermon, Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts. It is through their leadership and the tireless work of their staff that the arts are included and represented in broader discussions of issues such as sustainable communities. It is because of these efforts that we are able to have the types of discussions we will have today. As a former Torontonian, I have to make a plug for the Distillery District, a widely praised and well-known example of a creative placemaking project, reopened to the public in 2003. Tim Jones, President and CEO of Artscape, and one of our panelists here today, played a catalytic role in the redevelopment of the Distillery District. The district was transformed into a pedestrian-oriented arts, culture, and entertainment area. Once run down and abandoned buildings in the area are now home to unique boutiques, art galleries, trendy restaurants and cafes, as well as a microbrewery, theater, and artist studio spaces, way too trendy for me. The historic area is a popular destination for locals and tourists alike and has become one of Toronto's most distinct neighborhoods. The redevelopment of the district has spilled into neighboring areas, including Corktown. The establishment of new business, in turn, has attracted more business and residential development, improving and creating a sustainable community. And in another Toronto plug, Dr. Richard Florida, who is here today, has been an avid promoter of the importance of creativity in urban landscapes and megacities, and who is one of Canada's smarter imports from the United States. I would now like to introduce Rocco Landesman, Chairman, National Endowment of the Arts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deanna. And our deepest thanks to the ambassador and to all of your colleagues here at the embassy for so graciously hosting us today. I would like to also offer my special welcome to my Canadian counterpart and lunch companion today, Bob Sermon, the Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts. Thank you for joining us today. Since we're celebrating all things Canadian, I should say that while I am very, very fond of Bob personally, whenever I see him, I'm reminded that I have a severe case of budget envy, and I'll have to deal with it, I guess. And my thanks to all of you for joining us for today's discussion of creative placemaking. I've been asked to remind you that we're also doing a live webcast of today's discussion. So to everyone out there logged on and watching, let me say hi there and remind you that we have a hashtag for today's events, NEA Place. Carol, is a hashtag or hashtag like a PDF? Maybe you'll explain it to me later on. For everyone in this room, by attending this event, you're agreeing to possibly appear on camera and have your public comments and questions recorded. I've been lucky enough to spend time with both Carol Coletta and Ann Markusen. This is my first time in a room with Richard Florida, Tim Jones, and Rick Lowe, even though I've read them and read about them quite a bit over the past year. This is about the 1-year anniversary of my kicking off our own Artworks tour, but these 5 people here today have dedicated their careers to the ways that art works. I often joke that during my tenure at the NEA, all of the arts are equal, except theater. And many people, including our director of theater, Ralph Remington, who's here, expected that I would make my mark on the NEA's theater program. And while I take a great interest in Ralph's work and his attention to investing in innovative and challenging theater projects, I have spent most of my time in laying the groundwork for making funding available to invest in projects that help all the arts equally and that also help our country's neighborhoods, towns, and cities. We talk about these being place-based investments in creativity. Art is made pretty much anywhere and everywhere in this country, and where it is made is one of the most fundamental elements of what makes a work of art what it is. We're investing in a steel and fire sculpture in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, a work of art that makes sense there, given that town's history with steel mills. The Cornstalk Theater in Peoria, Illinois, wouldn't make all that much sense in New Mexico. Trey McIntyre's dance company is part of Boise, Idaho, and has become a very different entity than it would have been if they had remained based on the East Coast. So place can help inform art. But what can art do for a place? I believe there are essentially 4 returns on an investment in art that result in vibrant, sustainable communities. First, it contributes to livability, to the quality of life. Art is fun. It is challenging. It engages and delights us. We like living near the stuff. Then, too, it nurtures creativity and innovation. Richard and Carol have both spoken a lot about the mobility of the workforce. Thanks to technology and telecommuting, people can really work from anywhere these days. In an age where you can work anywhere, what makes you decide to live somewhere? Creative, innovative people like to be near one another and near creativity and innovation itself, 2 items that are the stock and trade of the arts. And Richard has written a lot about that, of course. Thirdly, the arts can help create an identity, a brand for a neighborhood. Lots of people have a strong sense of what San Francisco's mid-market neighborhood is about, and a sense that those are not streets to walk down. But the mayor and a coalition of arts organizations and businesses are using the arts to change that, to make the mid-market, known for being home to the luggage store gallery, to a weekly arts market, and to sidewalk performances. And finally, the arts drive local economies. By investing in arts organizations in a place, the residents spend more time there. Visitors come. Restaurants, bars, and businesses spring up. And we'll talk about this, I'm sure. These ROIs have led us at the NEA to propose a new grant program for next year. We're calling it Our Town. I'm a theater guy. I'm entitled, I think, to call it Our Town. It's a play. Through this program, we hope to invest $5 million in up to 35 communities that have a local tradition of the arts, that have a committed local philanthropic sector, and that have the local political leadership that gets it. I think you have to have those 3 elements in place if any initiative of the kind we're talking about is going to be successful. We want to support arts organizations to do what they do best, make and present art. At the same time, we want to make sure that arts organizations are fully citizens of the towns and cities they inhabit. They are committed to and contribute to the home places. In return, we want to make sure that the towns and cities recognize the arts as citizens and offer the support and infrastructure they need to thrive. Now, I'd like to turn things over to the brilliant and lightning-fast Carol Coletta. Carol is currently the president and CEO of CEO for Cities, and before that, she's been a consultant, the head of the NEA Mayor's Institute on City Design, and a radio host and producer. But most importantly, she joined me in Peoria, Illinois, for the very first stop on that Artworks tour I mentioned. She has since joined me in innumerable other places. I said to her just this afternoon that I hadn't seen her in quite a while. I got so used to seeing her almost every week, and it's great for me to reconnect with her again. Please welcome Carol Coletta.
Thank you, Rocco. I think he took me to Peoria to protect himself. After he made his comment, his famous comment about will it play in Peoria. I particularly appreciate the opportunity to talk about the arts from this particular angle, this notion of creative placemaking, because my job is is making successful cities and influencing successful cities to emerge. And I believe the arts and artists are very much part of the equation for successful cities. So it's going to be fun to explore this topic, I think, this afternoon for a few minutes with this quite wonderful panel. Richard Florida is on my far right. If you didn't know Richard Florida when you walked in the room, you probably should leave now. Richard, I think, brought so many new people to this conversation with his book, The Rise of the Creative Class. And then if you haven't read his new book, The Great Reset, it's fabulous. And he's also writing a series of blogs right now at Atlantic on creative density, which should be of interest to anyone interested in the topic of creative placemaking. Richard is now at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and of course he is our expert, but we're lucky to have the benefit of his thinking always. Richard, we're delighted to have you with us for this discussion. Tim Jones is a longtime friend and colleague. Again, he was introduced to you as well, and the mention of the Distillery District. He's president and CEO of Artscape, which is this really fabulously creative organization that has figured out a way in Canada not only to serve artists, but to also use their energy to reclaim places that others had forgotten and left abandoned, and he has revived them in very important and visible ways that adds great vibrancy to the city of Toronto. So always doing good work, Tim, and fun to have you here. Rick Lowe is a longtime inspiration for many of us. He is the founder of the project Row Houses in Houston, Texas. Took a neighborhood that again, no one really saw any potential in except him, and then with a collection of artists was able to revive that neighborhood. And again, that served as a model, I think, a very visible model for so many people trying to think about how to bring neighborhoods back to life. And we were talking earlier about a project he's now working on in Korea, which is quite fascinating. Again, a revitalization or a rethinking, really, of a neighborhood in a community there. So, Rick, I'm glad you're joining us. And then Ann Markusen, who I think has probably done more to unpack this subject of the economic impact of the arts, its real value, the notion of creative placemaking. I told Ann I just had an opportunity to reread her papers. If you haven't had a chance to do that, you really should, because they really are a fabulous body of work. I think you're about to take off for Scotland, aren't you? But she is professor and director of the project on regional and industrial economics at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs, and principal also of her firm Markusen Economic Research Services. And Rick, speaking of unpacking, I want to start with you. There's been substantial evidence of artists as creative placemakers in cities, but I think we're all still trying to figure out what is a creative place, how do we know it when we see it, and most of all, how do we bring it into being? How can we be intentional? I think we all sort of get the value, sort of. Ann's helped us understand that. Richard's helped us understand that. But how do you act with intention to bring it into being?
안녕하세요. That's all the Korean I have after a year of working in Korea. Thank you, Carol, for that introduction. And let me, as an artist, I work kind of from the philosophical framework of the German artist who coined the term in the 1970s social sculpture, in which he defined as the way in which we shape and mold the world around us. And in imagining a place that the world as a place that we're shaping and molding as a place for us, I thought Joseph Beuys, the most impactful thing for me from his teachings was that shaping and molding the world that we live in is not only for the artists. I mean, we have to find, the artists have to figure out how to inspire creativity within others, because if you're only having clusters of creativity among the artists in the arts communities and districts or whatever, you're missing a large part of the world. And so I've tried to focus my work from that premise, and over time, as Carol said, I've founded Project Row Houses, and most of my experiences have been from that. There's a few others from different projects here and there, but that's the core. And some of the things that went out, the question about what makes a creative place, I started thinking about Project Row Houses. What are the things that make that place a creative place? And so I came up with basically three things at the time about because I travel a lot, so I also get to look at Project Row Houses as a visitor, and I get to kind of see it from a different angle than it was when I was starting it in the middle of it. But one of the things I find is within that community that I consider a creative community is there's a certain kind of optimism among the people that are there. And I think that that is directly connected to this idea of artistic practice, of making and being creative. Artists would never make anything if they didn't have any kind of optimism about the possibilities of taking these materials that have no meaning apart, but they can put it together and give it some kind of meaning. So, as I look around, at the community, there's a certain kind of optimism among the artists as they produce their work, but also among the people that come within a relationship with our community because they feel the optimism of the artists. The second thing that that I find interesting and a big part of the creative environment there is there's this kind of sense of there's something inspiring about it, and that inspiration spreads from the artist to people around it, which in turn kind of help people identify their own creativity. It inspires them to kind of seek a creative voice for themselves, that they continue to make the place special for themselves, their families, as well as the broader community. And then the third thing was there's this notion of curiosity. In creative places, people are curious because there's so many new things that are constantly happening that it taps into their sense of kind of wonder about, you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you see some new thing that you had never seen before, and there's a kind of curiosity about that people want to explore. And I think that's directly connected to the fact that creative places are magnets for educated people. Educated people, they are curious, and it just kind of spur that kind of thing along. But the other side of it too, though, is it becomes a place of education for those who can who basically connect with the kind of inspiration that they see and the curiosity they see of the artists around. I give it just a couple of examples of things, of people and situations that I've seen at Project Row Houses. As far as the optimism side, there was a young woman that came to Project Row Houses as we started our transitional housing program for single mothers. And her name is Sada Richards, I had known her from this community for a long time as someone who was very negative and was a very bitter person. And she entered into that program, and I saw the transformation of this woman in a 2-year period that she transformed from being someone who was on academic probation at the University of Houston to actually finishing school there, getting a full scholarship to a PhD program at Penn State, completing that, teaching at University of Pittsburgh for 3 years. And it was just such an amazing transformation. And she's become one of the most incredibly articulate people for the power of being in a creative environment is. I mean, for her, when she came there and she listened to the artists there talk about the creative process of how you take things that most people have given up on or that are discarded in life, and you work with them, you give them care. It's an incredibly powerful tool there, and she's wonderful in terms of kind of making those articulating that to us. And then another little story I'll tell you. It's just one that's very simple, and I'm always puzzled by these things about what make them happen. But I think it's, in this particular case, as a neighbor, not associated with Project Row Houses, really. In fact, it took us 10 years of being in the neighborhood, and this woman was almost kind of a hermit, that we never saw her out, but she was curious because of all the creative things and all the things that were happening around. And it just kept bringing her out in her own way. And then all of a sudden, we saw this big shift. There was one artist project that one artist managed to get her to participate in a writing project that he was doing. He wanted her to tell a story. And it was amazing how it just transformed this woman to being one of the most active participants in our community. And that kind of lifting of spirit, I think, is one that sometimes it may not necessarily lift people into a creative voice of their own, but it actually gives them a kind of higher spiritual awareness of who they are, and they become more positive influence on the overall creative force of a community. And so I think that in closing, the thing that makes, I'm very confident of the sustainability of a place like Project Row Houses as long as we can keep the creativity alive, because it is through that creativity that we're constantly exploring. The curiosity is always up. There's always kind of people are inspiring each other, and that gives a certain kind of optimism, I think, that it takes to take on the challenges that come within growth.
Thanks, Rick. I think it's interesting the way you describe it as a circular process. It gives and it gets. Artists do work, but then they inspire others to a different place. And I also think, you begin to talk about the benefits that are very real, but perhaps are not quantified. And Tim, that makes me turn to you, because you've been engaged in some very big real estate projects, and we sort of know how to calculate the benefits of those. But how do you calculate the benefits of the other spin-offs that your big projects are producing?
Well, I think it's a tricky question, this idea of measurement, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I always love reconnecting with Rick and hearing about the kind of inspirational work that he's doing. But it's especially, I think, an honor to be on stage today with Richard and Ann, because when I think about the people who've made an influence on this planet in terms of understanding the relationship between creativity and place, I think there are probably no two better minds on the subject than we have here on stage here. And it's really about elevating the notion about, as Richard has done, about understanding creativity as the major driver of growth and change, but also sort of their determination to really come up with a fact base, a really kind of solid fact base that will help support greater focus investment policy in this area. And I'd also like to acknowledge, I think, the importance of arts councils in this, the funders in this debate, and thank the Rocco and the NEA for opening this conversation up. And frankly, it's something that we've seen this conversation happening for many years now, and it's been always a little bit perplexing to me that arts councils haven't been front and center in this discussion. And I'm a big fan of public support of the arts. As Bob knows, I used to work at the Canada Council and had a great time there. But I think sometimes that funders can get so focused on the trees and the tending to the trees that they forget about the broader forest or lose sight of their role in the broader ecosystem. And so I'm going to sort of just also preface my remarks by saying that to me, when I think about a creative place, I have to invoke the thinking of Charles Landry and his notion of a creative city, because I think that resonates, I think, most to me. And his idea was that places that are truly creative have creativity that kind of bubbles across all sectors, in the private sector, the public sector, the not-for-profit sector, and that this ingenuity and inventiveness, the openness, actually is contagious, and as Rick was just describing, it kind of affects other people. And in this context, arts and culture are really important strategic catalysts They're not the exclusive domain of creativity, of course, but they can help illuminate, illustrate, and inspire it in other people. And so part of the challenge with this concept of a creative city or creative place is that it's a utopian idea. And it's hard to point to the perfect poster child. I think about our experience in Toronto, and we get this in Toronto. We're living it. We've got sort of the mayor and our premier. They're always talking about it. And we have this vast ecology of people, of places, of infrastructure, firms, etc., that make up our creative ecosystem. But are we close to maximizing the creative potential of all people? I think not. Have we actually made strides toward improving the conditions for creativity in our community? I think we have. So I think it's a situation where places, it's not a cut and dried thing, and cities kind of come in and out of their creativity. And I think it's not just big cities where this is an issue. We've seen through places here in the U.S. like in Paducah, Kentucky, or Providence, Rhode Island, are great examples where arts and culture have been the catalyst for cities to rethink themselves, reimagine, and really emerge through very difficult times. So to get to your question, Carol, really the sort of issue about measuring the creativity of a place, I think, is really quite difficult. And it's not as simple as measuring something like the business climate, which is something that we're more, I think, attuned to. And I think for starters, there's not consensus on what we're measuring, right? And I think, for example, we could spend a couple of days talking about Richard and Ann's differing views on just that very topic. What is the creative sector? How big is it? Who does it include? These are all important questions. Ultimately, I think what's important is that creativity is valued. Because when creativity is valued in a community, then interesting things can happen. Smart people can make interesting things happen. And it's a good thing that we continue to obsess on this question about how we sort of measure impact, that we look at the intrinsic, the instrumental, the induced, the various forms of value that kind of flow out of arts, culture, and creativity. But I think ultimately it's also important to look at the sort of the way that value is communicated to people. And Rick has just given us a beautiful illustration of an anecdote from Project Row Houses that tends to have far more impact, frankly, than some of the data that one might sort of throw at these things. So I think that the anecdotal evidence is sometimes the most powerful kind of story. I think it's also important that the case makes sense intuitively, and I think, frankly, the power of Richard's thinking is that his idea is that art and culture, or creativity rather, is the driving force of growth and change in the world, and that these things are related to the competitiveness of places makes sense intuitively, and that's why they're powerful and have traveled all over the world. So, and I think thirdly, to back all of that up, we need some hard data, and I think that's where these guys come in, and I'm going to turn it over to them to talk about those things.
Ann? Well, it's fun to start even talking back to people a little bit here. I want to say that I'm not going to address this right now, but maybe in the second round of questions. But I think that creativity in a place isn't something that's sort of created by somebody from outside or just smart people. And I will be talking some about actual strategy to help every place be creative. That really starts with looking at what do you have already, and that there are many people that wouldn't be defined as smart according to degrees and so on and so forth, who are incredibly creative people and have distinctive cultures that are a part of. I like to just say that Mark Stern and Susan Seifert's work on natural cultural districts, to me, is one of the most, concrete, insightful bodies of work that's been done. But I wanted to address in my remarks to this question the impact thing and get very nuts and boltsy. And so just to contradict myself, I'll say that I'm going to use a case of where artists were sort of dropped into a community through the redevelopment of two old warehouses as a way of illustrating a multivariate set of outcomes that my colleague Ann Gadwa did a marvelous job documenting through mixed methods. And I'm just going to go through the consequences, the ways that we can actually measure and show and demonstrate creativity for artists, for the arts community and the general public, for the neighborhood, for the region and the economy. And I'd like to say that this work was funded by Artspace, which is a sibling of Artscape, and also a nonprofit artists live and work, and also, you know, arts facility developer in the United States. And they wanted this evidence because they constantly are invited into communities, and when it gets to trying to get the money packages together, the mayor and the politicians say, well, what is this going to do for us? This is a lot of money. Show us evidence that it's really going to work. The projects I'm going to speak to really fast, I want you to imagine 3 10 to 12 story warehouses from the 19th century, massive buildings, but beautiful in the Sullivan-esque style, sitting empty in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And in the early 90s, Artspace decided to redevelop these as artists live and work, and to some extent studio space. And our job was to really evaluate what happened 15 years later, going back to look and say, well, has this really made a difference? So let's just start with artists. First of all, we found, by the way, we used mixed methods for this. So we used surveys, we looked at tax returns of artists, which they have to supply to the buildings. We used census data, we did a lot of interviewing and so on and so forth, mostly Ann's work. Okay, first of all, artists. Artists were definitely better off for several reasons. One, they have unusual working needs that most of the rest of us don't have. They need space to store their stuff and put their chemicals and practice their music and so on. They had much better working conditions in these buildings. The space was affordable. That was part of the agreement. They could network with other artists, so they were in proximity with each other. And the result was greater productivity, more artwork, music, etc. produced, and also more time devoted to it. There were kind of mixed results, and they didn't all have higher incomes, but many of them actually were able to quit their day jobs and work on their art full time. And that, of course, opened up a job for somebody else in the region. For the regional arts community and the general public, the presence of these artists, by the way, 2 of these buildings are side by side in Lower Town, St. Paul, which was really just a vacated industrial area. And now there are 2 annual art crawls in this neighborhood with open studios, and this permits artists from all over the region, art lovers and patrons, citizens, people, residents of the neighborhood to go through and see artists in their, working space with their work. And for young people, it's very inspiring. Oh, this is how an artist lives and does their work, really a window into an occupation. The artists inspire others, and they also artists who are there can sell their work. So people actually sell a lot of work just as people are walking through these buildings. I myself have bought several pieces of art doing this. And it also raises the connectivity among artists in the larger region because people frequently, other artists come through, et cetera. And it really, I think, helps the arts community spirit to have this kind of gathering which opens up the inside of art making. And I think the general public also, many people from the general public come and animate this area and learn about artwork and learn about the people behind the work that they might otherwise just see on a wall without seeing the creator. The neighborhood. This was one of the most interesting bodies of work that we did because people, are always making these claims about the impact of the neighborhood. We did find that many other vacant properties were redeveloped subsequent to these buildings. We can't completely say it was because of these buildings, but it's very likely. Many of the existing businesses experienced an uptick in their business, and new businesses started up, especially cafes. Property values went up modestly. We did not really find evidence of gentrification. And of course, tax revenues went up. That was really great for the local government that had really put up some money for this. And also a farmer's market right across the street, a beautiful old one with a metal roof that had just been for parking cars for 30 years, has been revived and turned into, an active part, which again brings people into the neighborhood. Artists have also brought a lot of safety to the streets because artists are often on the streets different hours of the day and night. And so that makes, the more people on the street, the more safe it is. And also they have high rates of civic engagement. That's the perceptions of the other people in the neighborhood. And finally, the region. So besides the value of this artistic experience and expression, which I would say is the most important thing, it's clear also that these buildings have really helped regional competitiveness because they have drawn artists from other places. and they retain artists in our region who would otherwise go somewhere else. And some people really do create businesses out of these environments that they're in, small cultural industries that they go on and do other things. So that's the final end. So really that's all I wanted to say about that I think we have this is the era of accountability. Everybody is being asked to be accountable, not just people in arts and culture. And we can answer some of these questions. And telling stories is one way. And I tell a lot of stories, and I've interviewed a lot of artists and written up their profiles. But this kind of work, this kind of careful work, which we've developed a methodology to do, and I'm very happy to share it and give it away to anybody, is a really important part of what we need to do to be able to really increase the amount of excitement and interest and funding and buy-in by all the different parties that are needed to really make something like this happen. And that's, by the way, Ann and I have written a piece called Creative Placemaking, which will be issued by the National Endowment for the Arts sometime in the next month. And we have 15 really interesting case studies. And in the second question, I'll talk about some of those a bit.
Good. We'll look forward to it. Richard, I think you have, again, done the most remarkable job of connecting this whole subject of the arts and its impact in creative placemaking to the economic development world. You managed to resonate. Your message clearly resonated with that world, with mayors, and it provided, I think, such an important bridge. Can you talk a little bit about, again, you've sat down with all these mayors, all these economic development officials. What is it about the message that works for them, and what's still missing that we need to probe on proving the impact or making the case?
Well, thank you, Carol. I just want to say a couple quick thank yous. I want to say some thank yous to the two people who really, I think, were the force behind this really important session. And being an American who lives in Canada, this kind of session, which brings together thought leaders, doers, people who live between these two great countries on this great continent, is just really, really important to me. I remember the day my secretary came into my office and she said, "Rocco's on the phone." And of course, I thought that was the guy from the old neighborhood in New Jersey that I grew up with. Rocco's on the phone. And I pick up the phone, and it's this guy right here, Rocco Landisman, calling me. That doesn't happen, certainly every day or every week or every month. So his force of intellect and strategy, and on the Canadian side, and the Canada Council is well represented, I would argue the most brilliant thinker of them all on the issues of innovation, economic competitiveness, and how arts and culture fit in, a man who couldn't be here today named Joe Rotman. Joe Rotman developed Canada's innovation strategy, developed its entrepreneurship strategy. He funded the business school I teach in. He funded my institute. He helps him. He helped build our art museum, and he is bringing this connection to us. So, wow, for Rocco and Joe and the NEA and the council to bring this together, I'm blown away, and I pledge to continue to stay involved in this. Secondly, I'm humbled to be here, and I got to tell you guys why. Not only is I think this might be my first time ever giving a talk in like a real live embassy. So I'm just blown away to be in a real live embassy. I've been to a party in an embassy before. But because this is about arts and culture, and I stumbled into this, I guess arts and culture has always been a personal motivation to me in a very limited way. I was a guitar player. I was a pretty good guitar player. I'm a rock and roll guitar player. And I thought that's what I was going to do for a living, until I realized, like a former president of the United States, President Clinton, realized he wasn't going to be a saxophone player. And I'll tell you guys this, I don't tell this a lot, I still feel a lot more comfortable in a guitar store than I do in a library, even though I've ended up being a writer. So I think arts and culture helped define me as a person in a way that I can't, because my dad brought me a guitar when I was 7. But I think I've always been scared of engaging the dialogue about arts and culture at this high level. As a working class kid from New Jersey, Dad worked in a factory. I didn't know how to fit in. And so when I wrote a book to economic developers, right, and Carol was one of the first people to read my work before it became Rise of the Creative Class, and artists and cultural people and people who ran cultural institutions, I was like, I can't believe my work is having some little impact on this world. So I'm really, really humbled to be here. And I think it's been the community I've been most proud to be able to speak to and hopefully elevate. I think what we're all about is elevating this conversation and having a new kind of conversation about arts and culture. So, Carol, what do I say to a mayor? If you want to grow your town, stop pissing money away. Stop wasting money. spending that $1 billion or more on your stadium complex. Handing over, and Ann knows this, we've worked in this field for so long, handing over a big blank check to some company to come to your town, and it used to be an industrial company, and then it was a headquarters, and now it's a call center. Handing over this big giant check for a company to come to town. This is small scale investment, and from everything everybody said, it seems to work. And why? Well, we've been able to do a little research. Not me, our community of people who think about this. And now economists have gotten interested in this. It's not just that high human capital people or people with degrees spur development. What you find is that communities, when you look at large data sets that have lots of artistic and culturally creative people who are professionally employed, there's a very high correlation between that and any measure: economic output, wages, income, rates of innovation. So for some reason that we are not quite clear on, it's a correlation like business and financial management, like computer scientists and high-tech professionals. It's very high and significant. So it matters. Two, if you want people to hang around your town and you don't want them to leave, people who are really inclined to make a commitment to a community are artists and culturally creative people. I learned this at Carnegie Mellon, and to be quite plain, our science and tech students tended to leave, and the kids in architecture and arts and theater and music were much more likely to make a connection to the community and stay and want to build. But there's all kinds of reasons for that, but it's just an observation. The other thing that I think is even more important, that I think people still don't get, and there's still a lot of argument, about statistical correlation, but the point of fact is that places that are artistically and culturally creative, they tend to be the same kind of places that are highly innovative, generate new businesses, new startups, high levels of entrepreneurship. So my best example of that, is the San Francisco Bay Area. Before I never knew of a high-tech company in the San Francisco Bay Area, I knew it was a place that art and music and literature and popular culture was invested. Before, I heard of Microsoft, I knew that Jimi Hendrix was from Seattle. Before I heard of high-tech Austin, I knew that Willie Nelson there. I'm not saying this correlation is one-to-one, but what I say is if that's what you're after, trying to make yourself involved in artistic and cultural creativity will help you. One pet thing, just for everybody in here, we got to get musicians more into this conversation. Music is incredibly important to economic development in cities, music industries. Musicians are very good at bootstrapping. And in a lot of our conversation about artists, musicians fall out. The best example of a case study of a place that's been a remarkable economic turnaround story, and I would argue as important to look at as a knowledge-based community as Silicon Valley is Nashville, Tennessee. The dramatic and radical transformation of Nashville, Tennessee around music and becoming a center for music is something we just need to know more about and talk about. But musicians are really important, and Tim and others are doing work on this. And then people care about arts and culture. And this came out in work the Gallup organization and we did together. When you look at what not only makes a place wealthier, when you look at what gives people a high degree of happiness in their town, a high degree of community satisfaction, emotional attachment, and I don't want to make either or conversations. Yes, safe streets matter. Yes, good schools matter. Yes, many good business job opportunities matter. But at the top of the list is the aesthetic character of a place, the blending between its arts and cultural creativity and its natural environment. And Tim said this, creative places are just multidimensional. I learned a lot from this guy all the time. And I say this we lived in this, I lived in this country for 50 years and lived in this city, my wife Rhonda and I, for the better part of 3 years. Americans need to take a better look at cities outside their country, and I'll tell you why. I went to a meeting of a major foundation here about arts and community development and urbanism, and I met with the head of that foundation, who's a dear friend, and I said, I learned a lot. There was a guy named Marty Lipset who taught at George Mason. I took his job. He said, if you want to understand America, he wrote a book called Continental Divide. He said, you better come up and look at Canada. I said to this guy, if you want to look at a place that really gets city building, you should come look at Toronto. He said, I've never been there. For folks here in this country, in the United States, I think Tim mentioned this, the Canadian cities really get it. Toronto really gets it. I think Montreal may, with all humility, even get it more on that dimension. But Tim posed a really important challenge, which he didn't mention. This is important for the council, it's important for the NEA, it's for all of us. He said so much of arts, Tim, you can build on this later, so much of what arts has been about and culture has been putting creativity on display. And the real challenge of our time is to put that creativity to work. And I think that's really what this conversation is about now. How do we make sure that arts are something that's not only displayed, or as the museum director at the Andy Warhol Museum said, great art isn't made in a museum. I think really empowering artists and musicians and creative people to use their talent to develop it is kind of the key question in the conversation as well. So Carol, sorry, I think that's what I try to say.
Thank you, Richard. We have only a little bit of time left. I'm going to take until 5 after to give these guys some time to answer another question, and then if you have questions, we'll give you about 10 minutes to get into the conversation, and we may have some questions from Twitter. So I will ask the staff to let me know that, and in the meantime, though, I want to ask each of you to keep your answers to about 3 minutes. Okay, so if you were, this is a very important question, and there's short attention span by the people who would be asking you these questions. If you were advising a mayor or a community leader about the best investment they could make in jump-starting creative placemaking in their communities, what would you tell them? Tim, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, well, I think that there's a really growing community of practice around creative placemaking. It's a very exciting time. Actually, there's the Approach by Project for Public Spaces that focuses on the beautification, the improvement, animation of the public realm. There are public art strategies, the cultural district strategy, cultural tourism strategies. There's a cadre of consultants out there that are pushing new urbanism and different forms of mixed-use development. There's a process called municipal cultural planning that's been pioneered in Canada that's about looking at planning through a cultural lens. And then there's Artscape's approach to creative placemaking, which really is about leveraging the value that creative people bring to communities and using it to serve their needs, but also to build cities at the same time. So I'd say to the mayor that there's a menu of options out there to look at. There are a lot of interesting case studies, a lot of examples. But what you really need to do is look at sort of, it's really a process of discovery, and Ann alluded to this. You really need to respond to the unique challenges, opportunities, ideas, aspirations of your community. And so it really is a process that one needs to embark on. And, there's a saying in the, that's I think very fitting for the development community that says, if you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu. You heard that. And I think that's true of the arts community, right? And frankly, we're often not even on the menu. We're just roadkill, right, when it comes to development. So we have to actually get beyond this kind of this crazy headspace that says that we're the hapless victims of the gentrification process. We have to understand the value that we create in communities. And victimhood is not like a great strategy in terms of, especially when your powerful agencies have changed. So we have to rethink the way that we do that. And that's what we've been doing. That's what Artscape's been all about, is really thinking about how we reposition our projects. So yes, they're about affordable space for the arts, but they're also about regenerating communities. They're about sort of strengthening the local economy, retaining employment space in cities. They're reusing heritage sites, promoting social cohesion, creating real estate market buzz. We'll do all of those things. And really, it's, what we're trying to do is demonstrate that it's possible to do these things. It's possible to both serve the needs of the arts community and build the city at the same time. So finally, I'd say to the mayor, as Richard has just said, come up to Canada, come visit us in Toronto, check out our website where we're actually sharing a lot of this knowledge. And most importantly, I'd encourage them to say, there are all this huge wealth of opportunities out there. You just have to spend the time and discover what the unique opportunity is in your town.
Great, thanks, Tim. Ann, let me turn to you.
Okay. Well, I would, I just totally agree with Tim that every place is different, and there's a strategy for every place, large and small. And I would really start by telling the mayor that she should really think about what is distinctive about the local community. And this goes from small to large. In our case studies, we had this tiny little place, Arnaudville, Louisiana, where an artist returned, established artist returned, and all of a sudden he realized this is a Cajun place. We could really, work around the Cajun music here, and we could do French language, and he started something that's just been an amazing renaissance for a place that's not even on an interstate. And at the other end, San Jose, the city of San Jose, they're going, we don't have enough artists here. We got all these techie people. Think what we could do if we put artists and techie people together. So right now in San Jose, there's this amazing 01 biennial going on, which looks for artists, works with a lot of arts organizations to find artists, and not just from San Jose, from all over the world, to come and really artists who use technology, and they're trying to really start businesses out of this, and also they're trying to help people in Silicon Valley develop, a sort of understanding of their, of this, unique characteristic. Secondly, I think it's really important to not think in terms of the Bilbao model. Oh, if we could just get the Guggenheim to come here or something appropriately scaled, but to really think about if you can't get your own community jazzed up first, and to patronize whatever the thing is that you're doing or creating, then you're lost. And the only way other people are going to be attracted is if there's buzz. So I could give examples of this. A tiny little place in 5 hours north of Minneapolis, New York Mills, just started this New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. Now all the people around there come and they do all the different art forms. They have an artist in residence program, and it's completely revitalized their little downtown strip, which was nowhere. The third thing I would say is partner across missions. This is a very important part of our creative placemaking piece, and it's really, Rocco and Joan's inspiration that, arts is, well, it's not, they wouldn't say this, but I would, arts has been in such a silo for a long time, 30 years being in a silo. We're arts, we're the nonprofit arts, there's the commercial people over there. We don't talk to them, and we don't ever really think about how is art connected to health or environment and so on and so forth. In our study, again, one of our case studies is the Fond du Lac Indian Reservation in northern Minnesota, where the guy who heads their social services complex pitched to his tribal leaders that art is a part of healing, and that they should spend a part of every building they build on buying art from contemporary Ojibwa artists and hanging it on the walls of places. An amazing museum where people themselves are directly experiencing this beautiful work that speaks to their culture. And another example is the Portland Metra system. Here, the case of transportation, where staff of the transportation, so we're building these new light rail stations. Let's use art as a way of getting people, to ride. And while we're at it, why don't we try to make each one of these stations express the neighborhood, and let's consult the community, like what they want. And you'll have to read the studies to see what we're doing. And now they actually convinced the Department of Transportation to have this, public art as a part of the federal funding. And now the city of Los Angeles has been doing the same thing with its stations on its metro. And then finally, I would say search for connections with cultural industries. So, and I think this is important because you can't just rely on artists, creative people to start businesses or whatever. Most places have some potential for cultural industries. And I won't go in, my city, Minneapolis, is really publishing and advertising are really big, and they both employ a lot of artists. And so just thinking about that, the city, I think in the case study that we have that says this best is Seattle, where the mayor in Seattle said, I want to have a city of music, as part of his political campaign. Let's get all these young music people here, and look what music's done for Seattle. It's drawn all these people in. And so go look at their website, Seattle City of Music, and all the incredible things they've done. And finally, you can read our creative placemaking study, which, looks at a lot of these different studies and also has 7 or 8 different answers to this question of what to tell the mayor.
Great. Richard, advice? You may have already given it, but I'll give you another shot at it.
I'll try to be really brief. I think the first thing is what I asked Jane Jacobs this. And when I asked her what her advice to the mayor would be, she said to me, you asked me the wrong question in only the way Jane could. And I looked there stunned, and she said, the important thing is to go ask, it wasn't about artists, but she would say, go ask the artists and the creative people. So that would be the first thing I would say to a mayor, that you, and others have said that, you have to engage these communities and gain their input and use their own creativity. So that's number one. Second thing I'd say is get out of the way. And I think Tim probably knows this better than I do, but so much of what local public policy is, building codes, zoning regulations, are in the way of artists doing all the things they would naturally do. And if they bump against that once, it's okay. If they bump against it twice, it's all right. But the 10th time, it becomes a little demoralizing. So figure out not only what to do, but what to move out of the way. I would say, and again, agreeing with what others said, don't look at arts as a silo. And it's the topic of today's conversation. Look at the intersection of arts and culture and place. And it seems to me that, crudely, if the social and economic organizing unit of the industrial age was the company, the social organizing unit of this knowledge-based technology creative age is a place. And so if you want to build up your place and make it stronger, well, one of the best levers you have to push on, it's not the only lever you can push on, is your artistic and culturally creative community.
And Rick? But you have to speak.
I would first suggest that the mayor actually make some decision whether they want to kind of utilize creativity for the sake of generating economic production, or if they want to use creativity for the generation of placemaking. Because to me, I think there are some kind of differences there that they both may help economically, but one is much faster, more expedient than the other. And then once you make that decision, there's another thing I think is that as Tim said, there are a lot of different ways you can approach trying to engage creativity in placemaking. And from my perspective, there are two major ways. One is clustering artists, creating these artist clusters where artists get to feed off each other and generate creativity. But the other one is more integrating artists within different kinds of communities, not just neighborhoods. I mean, I focus on neighborhoods, but as Ann said, artists could be integrated into public works programs or health facility programs, environmental programs, those kinds of things, which has a tendency to sometimes to help make place in those places as well. And the reason I've been thinking a lot about this clusters versus kind of integrating is, and I have nothing to back this up. It's just something that I've been thinking about. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and maybe you guys have research on this, or somebody's going to do research on this. But I often go to the area where there's the musicians' village, and I'm always questioning what's happening to that bundle of creativity as it's being clustered in this one area, as opposed to prior to Hurricane Katrina, musicians, whom I include as artists, they were dispersed throughout that city. And so different places gain their identities through these musicians. Some musician was from housing project here, was from housing project there, some musician from some other neighborhood or whatever. And it made those places, those musicians became who they are because of being where they were in these very unique places. So sometimes clustering, to me, can kind of minimize the creative impact. And I'm not, and Tim and I talked about this a little bit coming over. I mean, they're intertwined, the idea of clustering and disbursement. But that's one of the things I think that would be, something of great consideration to kind of figure out which of those would make sense to achieve the objectives that they're trying to achieve.
If you have a question, there are microphones on either side of the room, and I would invite you to go to a microphone to ask your question. Do we have any questions through Twitter? Hello in the back? Yes, we do. While you're ringing that down there, and someone is moving to the microphone, so let me take the microphone question first and go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much. This is on behalf of our guests who are tuning in from Twitter. Could the panel talk a little bit more about the role of philanthropy in creative placemaking, especially on the local level, the idea of partnerships with philanthropic organizations? What are some creative financing sources or suggestions of those kind of sources?
Yeah. Let me ask both Tim and Rick to address that question. Tim?
Well, I think, like arts councils, philanthropists are coming late to the party on this discussion, but it's encouraging what we're finding in Toronto, that there is renewed interest from major donors to get into the business of making places through culture. Of course, philanthropy has always been about city building in some way, shape, or form. And I think, whether it's building sort of hospitals or schools or other kind of some of the larger cultural institutions, I guess I think philanthropists have done a huge, important role. In Toronto, we've just seen $1 billion of investment in our major cultural institutions that have been all remade. I think the next phase now is to take that thinking and encourage that philanthropy to go down the chain of down the line in the creative community, so that we're hitting where creativity meets the streets, where it builds our communities and neighborhoods. And I think that's where we'll truly see some really amazing transformation begin to happen.
And I just I think philanthropy is extremely important, because it kind of hits on this point that Richard was saying that he would suggest to the mayor is to have city government kind of step out of the way. Well, that's a hard thing for city government to do, but it's a hard thing for government to do. But the great thing about philanthropy is generally there's much more flexibility. And so one of the things that we've been able to do in our small housing developments is actually to use private philanthropic dollars to kind of leverage artist housing or providing housing within our community for artists that we could not necessarily do through the monies that we get from the state. I mean, from HUD.
Can I I want to just say really quickly that I've just learned recently that there's a new thing afoot, and actually I think it had something to do with Rocco, coming to Minneapolis, but McKnight Foundation, our largest foundation, the arts program officer figured out that if she works with the community development part of the foundation, a lot of these foundations have, the big ones, they have people over here doing community development, people over here doing arts, and they never talk to each other. So, and they're working on a Native American cultural corridor in Minneapolis, which, where the arts program people are putting up the money for the gallery, but they're working hand in hand for the first time with the community development people in their same foundation.
That's a great example. Yeah, arts are not the only ones siloed. Did you have another?
There's one additional question from, again, those of our guests who are tuning in from our webcast. How can the, quote, academic corporate complex measure creativity differently so that it's not seen as inefficient?
Oh, well, that's a question for Ann.
Oh, maybe it's a question for Richard. I don't know. I have to think
Richard about it. Or Ann.
I'll start just really, I think it's a critical question, and I think that's only partly a Canada Council or NEA question. That's a question for the people who really collect big-scale census data. Our measures of creativity in general are very poor. Ann and I both work using occupational measures to do that. Before that, mostly everyone who worked in our field used firm-based measures. Other people who measure creativity use patents. I mean, so how does patent tell you anything about artistic creativity? And if we really are in a knowledge-based and a creative economy, we need better measures. And I think other panelists have said this, not just measures of people who are paid principally to use their creative work or do artistic work, about the creative inputs that occur across our society. So I would honestly say, in the Great Depression, and slightly before, but in the Industrial Revolution and the Great Depression, we invented a whole new series of metrics. I walked by some of the buildings this morning where those metrics were pioneered and used to look across our economy. We really need a national effort to develop better metrics. We can only do as best we can with the measures we have, but the measures we have are very limited and poor, and I would think that's a number one agenda for both Canada, which recently cut its long-form census survey, and the United States, that we make a real commitment to these measures. They're very important.
Ann, anything to add?
Well, I just want to say that, I've said this in print also, that, we can't measure creativity by whether or not you have a college degree. And so, but it is very hard because I always argue, I've seen some home health aides who are the most creative people in the world at dealing with really, really difficult clients. How do we, work that into it? So that's why I passed the buck, because I think it's tough and it's a challenge, and I'm really glad it was raised, and we'll be working on it for 10 or 20 years, all of us.
Good. Let me go here for your question, and then I'll come here, back and forth.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask how the recession has affected both the thinking in this field and maybe even shaped it in some ways. In that question, has there been research done to see have artists lost their jobs sooner or later than other groups? Have they gained them more quickly or slowly back? And has it affected the kinds of partnerships that have happened in cities that, because so much of the thinking that's here and studied here has developed over even 2 decades or more. And I was curious about the suddenness of the recession and how that might affect.
Ann, I'll turn to you again.
Okay, well, really, Sunil should answer this question. I know he's here somewhere. So Sunil Iyengar is the research director at NEA, and he's done some really good work on this. So I think I can say that yes, I think we've seen, and other people have done some work too on this, that artists have lost jobs, a little faster than other people, so their rates of unemployment are a little higher. But of course, artists have very high levels of self-employment, something like 48% if you count people who do it as a second job too. So I would say in general that arts organizations have been hit very, very hard because funders have lost money through asset implosion, and because governments have really, one of Sunil's studies was on the theater sector and showed from the earlier recession in this decade that theaters particularly lost, government funding, and so on and so forth. So I think this, and Holly Sidford wrote a great piece about this. Actually, she did a survey in interviews in the Seattle region and wrote it up. And I think you can find it on heliconcollaborative.com. Or that it is a time of deeper thinking for arts organizations. They have been hurt really badly, and they're beginning to think out of the box. Well, who else can I partner with? And not necessarily doing things the same way. So I think we're at an incredibly rich, productive moment. We need as much thought and conversations, broader conversations than we had before. And I think, the course that Rocco and Joan are charting at the NEA is just really marvelous because it's really helping us do that. And it's uncomfortable. I run an arts and cultural policy study group in my city. I've been doing this is our 5th year. And I have a lot of arts people. I have some other people in there too. And it's really hard. We just had a second round on this creative placemaking last week, and it's still really hard to venture outside the known way, but I think it's happening, and there's just a lot more exciting. There's a lot of Stephen Tepper's work I think has been wonderful on participation and defining participation as more than attendance. That's the other incredible thing that's happening, I think, is that the arts world is beginning to understand it's not just about we present, you're sitting in the seats. It's about people dancing in the aisles at the LA Philharmonic and just all kinds of other things like that. So it's an exciting time.
Great.
Well, I just want to say first thank you to the panel for a very provocative and informative conversation. My question relates to the conversation you all have been having about the important role that artists and creatives play in the development of creative placemaking. It seems like in many communities around the country, there's a lot of marketing and effort put into attracting creatives to a community. And I'm interested, as I think Ann pointed out, about working cross sectors and what the role of education might be in growing our own creatives in a community, particularly in some of our public education systems. K-12, there's less of an emphasis on developing the creative capacity of students. So just as Carol asked the question about what might you say to a mayor to make the case for creative placemaking, I'd be interested if any of the panel might be able to speak to the question of what would you say to a school superintendent to make the case for creative placemaking?
Tim, take that.
I mean, one of the things, the beauties of creative placemaking is that it can do a lot of different, it can engage people in all kinds of different ways. And the real challenge of it is how you align the interests of the educational institution with the interests of community people and the interests of the artistic community. So it's about finding that shared space where everybody can be happy and everyone can win. The reality is, and we've been doing this for 25 years in Toronto, people in cities want the same things. They want healthy, vibrant, sustainable communities that are walkable, that are livable, that are culturally rich, right? the educational institutions share that interest. And the great thing is that when you can actually build sort of a vision, a truly shared vision from the ground up in community, there's nothing more powerful than that. So I think that there are lots of innovative examples of universities and colleges working alongside arts institutions and individual artists to do interesting projects. You can certainly draw on those things, but I think that the reality is that these things have to be built from the ground up, and they work best when they're really sort of you can galvanize people's interest where it's really shared across sectors. That's when it becomes really potent.
Now you have me to a worry point. And if you ask me one of the biggest obstacles to the full flourishing of creativity in our economy and society amongst everyone, the home healthcare aides, food preparation, factory workers, agriculture, scientists, it's our schools. Tim and I have a very dear friend, Sir Ken Robinson, who I've learned an amazing amount about. And you just look at one of his charts of what happens to the creative capacities of a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and it just goes down the more they're involved in institutionalized learning. In the book I just wrote, The Great Reset, I was able to look at how societies reset in times of economic crises. One very important theme, especially for the American case study, is that we reset our educational system every time. We invented mass public education to give people basic skills to work on factories. In the Panic of 1873, in the Great Depression, we extended high school learning. We brought on, after the war, the GI Bill. And I think the educational remake we have to do is bigger than both of those combined and an order of magnitude on top of that, because the system just doesn't work. It's completely broken. It seems to me that it starts from a very simple principle. We have to enhance the creative capabilities of kids, not destroy them. And everything we should do should be to enable those creative capacities. And I think thinking of education as real estate, I mean, it's just such a no-brainer. Education isn't about building these giant factories. It's about building systems that work, and in some ways, the city itself, right? If you could just think about this, the city itself. We've seen this at higher ed with places like Savannah College of Art and Design. We've seen it with RISD in Rhode Island. We've seen higher ed begin to bust apart and become more the fabric of the city. Yeah, imagine the competitive advantage you could get as a city or a community that had schools that really enable kids' creativity. You'd go like crazy. So I think we need a big rethink there. And I think artists and creative people could help us see the way, because oftentimes they've been the people who are least satisfied. Some of the people have been least satisfied with the formal educational experience.
I'm counting 5 more questions, and it's 4:15. I just want at 4:17. I want to do a time check. If we go to 4:30, we're okay. All right. I'm going to ask you to. We're okay. Okay. I want to keep the questions short, the answers short, so we can get all of these in. You're next.
Great. Thank you. I guess I want to go to Rick's point about the social sculpture. And I thought my question was kind of out of left field until Ann started mentioning more and more about health. And you keep all talking about a healthy community. I'm from the healthcare space, healthcare reform. So I'm just curious if there's ever been a correlation or data, because as you go into these mayors, and at least in the United States, as we hit these sort of funding cliffs in the next couple of years, where there's just going to be no resources, I'm really interested in these creative partnerships in terms of talking about innovating cities. And I guess I'm maybe more talking about a little bit about the underserved. My only one example is, I will try to make this short, is the Manhattan Plaza high-rises in Manhattan, which are 2 46-story towers that are housing for the performing arts, Section 8 public housing for the performing arts, where I know for a fact that 90% of the people that live there, particularly the elderly, die in their own homes, which is just this incredible thing. I mean, they're not artists, but it's not the arts, but it houses your artists. Is there data? Is there anything that sort of correlates literally a healthy community after you guys have come in and sort of innovated it with the arts?
Great question. Although I think we have no answers.
There is a whole movement around art and health. I mean, there's a whole movement of organization of people, of artists, working with healthcare providers around how I have these great photos of an entrepreneur in Minneapolis where she's actually, created these incredibly colorful abstract designs, learned how to project them by light onto substrate, so when you're sitting in your dentist's office or you're in intensive care, you can be engaged by this incredible artwork around you. So I know there's a lot of that, but I really don't know that much more about it. But it's a great question.
But Richard?
The research is really crude, and it's cross-sectional. But we've been probing this a lot. with psychological well-being, because Gallup has given us good numbers. We have very good numbers on smoking and very good numbers on obesity. The correlations between the creative occupations broadly and those outcomes are off the charts. And I can't find the sheet, of course, because I'm an absent-minded professor, but I just had my team before we came down there look at the artistic occupations. Now, one has to do a lot better, but yeah, there is an enormously strong association or relationship between places that have more working artists across domains and these better smoking outcomes, better health outcomes, and certainly higher levels of psychological well-being. And the associations with psychological well-being are very high. So there's something there, and I would encourage us in economics and in healthcare to take a much deeper look at that.
I'll just add quickly that Arts Council England, I know, has done all kinds of work looking at the instrumental impact of including health and many other areas of arts and culture. And I know that either through Arts Council England or the International Association of Arts Councils that one could probably draw on that research.
Good. Richard, there must not have been any dancers in that artist community related to smoking. Go ahead.
Highest LQs for dancers are Las Vegas, I think, the last time I looked.
My question's about, as one develops various visions for creative placemaking, and Rick, you touched on this, about how do we avoid the pitfall of making it a middle-class vision of creative placemaking?
Rick, you want to take that? Tim, you want to take that?
I think it really is about building it from the bottom up, really, and finding sort of what the aspirations, the dreams, the ideas are from the local community. And when you engage sort of creative people in this discussion, you find all kinds of new and surprising things. And it's unlikely to be a middle-class vision that emerges through a process if you truly engage the community. So that's the thing about creative placemaking. It really has to be driven from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Right here.
I just wanted to make one quick announcement because for those of you here, it seems like a very intimate group at the embassy, but for panelists and for all of us joined here today, I wanted to let you know that we've had more than 1,000 people join us via our webcast, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. One more question?
I'll defer to Rocco, who I think has something to say, and then if there's time, come back to me.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was struck in the discussion by the emphasis that the panelists placed on cities that already have very substantial creative cultural capital, Toronto, Twin Cities with its great theater and art, and so on. My question is, what do you say if you're talking to the mayor of Camden, New Jersey?
Great question. Thank you. It's a great question.
My thing is always, and I think what Richard hit on this was that you want to talk to the creative people that are there, and I think that one of the big problems I think the creative sector has had is that once we kind of became siloed, we have a tendency to want to be very protective of how our identity as the creative sector is dealt with, and so there are all these other creative people around the arts doing amazingly creative things. I was just at RISD yesterday, and we're sitting in this group, and this guy was telling me about these incredible tours that he was doing within this neighborhood. And after I did my talk, and we were all sitting around, and he was like, I've never been kind of invited into this conversation about art and culture because what I do is not art and culture, and that's not because he didn't want to be in that conversation. It's because we've kind of created this silo that we don't let people in. And I think as long as the mayor of Camden or whatever is wanting to identify the top name artist that's going to perform at Lincoln Center or something like that as the kind of artist that they want to bring in, they're not going to do it. But if they draw upon the local creativity that already exists in those communities, that's where they need to start.
Good.
Camden is full of people dancing, people singing in church, graffiti, and all kinds, and youth music in general. So, that's what I would do if I were talking to the mayor of Camden. I'd say, well, let's do kind of an inventory. How many people are really engaged already in these different things, and how can we think about, what are the outstanding parts of that? There's this brilliant piece, I'm going to forget this guy's name, in this book about how, in societies in Africa, everybody learns to dance or do music, and it doesn't mean that they don't know who's really good and give them a special place in their community. And actually, they appreciate, artistic talent even more because they know how hard it is. And so, really thinking in that kind of way, well, what can we do starting from that, to build more presence about that and more celebrate that more and think about the spaces where that happens and so on.
Great. Rocco, last word.
Okay. My question is related to Rogers, and it's addressed to Richard. I guarantee you this is not the first time you've been asked this question. But a big part of the narrative, as I understand it, is that people follow other people. People want to be around artist clusters. They want to be where things are happening. And they're drawn to places because of this. Okay, so you establish an arts corridor in Minneapolis and arts clusters and arts organizations, and there's tremendous vibrancy. Isn't this a zero-sum game and very bad for Duluth?
I think it relates to the previous question.
Right.
And so there's an empirical issue, and then there's a normative one. The empirical issue is that if you trace the locations of working artists and culturally creative people, they are extraordinarily concentrated. And they tend to concentrate in the biggest metropolitan areas. In other words, the concentrations in New York and LA as metropolitan areas are much higher than might otherwise be expected, and they fall off from there. Although Nashville has done fine. Washington, D.C. has actually done better than might be expected. But that means when you're attracting working artists and culturally creative people. And I think everyone in this conversation has said the same thing. Creativity is the only thing, or one of the key things in our world, that is not a zero-sum game. That every single person, that's been the core of my work. It's actually, the core of my work is not about attracting the creative class. It's not about attracting artistic and cultural creative people. The core of it is about stoking that creative furnace that lies deep inside each and every person. Going back to the Camden point, guess where I met the most creative people in my life? You would think it was graduate studies at MIT or Columbia, teaching at the University of Toronto or Carnegie Mellon. It was a boy growing up in Newark and North Arlington, New Jersey. Guess how many of those kids made it out? I can count them on one hand. So I think that's really the next agenda in this conversation. It goes back to things the panel said, that everyone said. We're going to have to expand this agenda to making more and more people, right? You just said it. That person didn't feel like they were part of the artistic and cultural community. I think it means making more and more people feel they're part of this creative movement, if you will. And I think that's the way around it, Rocco.
Oh, I want to add to that too, though, that when you talk about the higher cluster of artists, or in New York, LA, whatever, I think you also have to be thoughtful about what kind of artists are clustering in places. Artists are clustering where there are markets for their work, if that's what they're producing. But there's a whole breed of new kind of thinking artists whose market are communities, and they're not going to cluster in LA and New York, because that's not where their market is. And so I think it's smart for people to start tapping into those artists that are finding a different kind of market and make that a place of focus.
When you say different kind of market, just...
Their market is community-based work. I mean, that's how they fulfill their creative exploration.
Okay. And Ann?
Oh yeah, I've done a lot of work on migration of artists in the United States, and migration, artists do have very high migration rates. Really up there with scientists and engineers, but they have really distinctive age-related patterns. So young artists leave small towns for nearby cities, and when they have to go to New York or LA at certain times, certain kinds of artists and so on. But a lot of them go back later. And I found this amazing thing happening in my state, Minnesota, where from 16 to 28, there was a huge out-migration from every place that wasn't the Twin Cities. But then in the next age group, which was late 20s through 40, there was a big reverse migration, and people went to small and medium-sized places in Minnesota because they were established artists, or because they wanted to live, or because they were, they could get really cheap space. I mean, for all kinds of reasons. And so again, which is a great thing for mayor of those towns, I say, let your young people go. They need to go. They need to have the exposure. But work on getting them to come back later. So I think that, this is, it's just important. This is why research matters too. We need to really understand what's going on. And Rocco, it's time for you to come to Duluth, and I offer to show you around. You wouldn't believe what's happening in Duluth.
How about Bemidji?
Yes, Bemidji. Also, we'll go there too.
Well, on that note, please help me thank our panel.
Thank you, Carol.
And there is a reception in the reception area, I don't know, right outside the auditorium, so you'll get a chance to speak with the panelists further if you want. Thanks.